Good evening to those in eastern and central states. Good afternoon to those in mountain states on the West Coast and in Hawaii. And good morning to those watching from China. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome audiences from 81 venues throughout the United States and 4 venues in China to our 10th annual China Town Hall, Local Connections, National Reflections. We created this program 10 years ago in the belief that the U.S.-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, one that is defining the 21st century. Since 2007, the program has expanded from just over 30 venues to now over 80, a testament to the growing recognition that getting the relationship right is essential for global peace and prosperity. Our program tonight could not come at a more timely moment. Last year, U.S.-China trade exceeded $600 billion. More than 300,000 Chinese students studied in the United States, and cross-border investment directly supported a combined 1.7 million jobs. The joint ratification of the Paris Climate Agreement inaugurated a new era of Sino-American cooperation despite friction in other areas. As we approach Election Day, we must think about the next 4 years and ways we can work together to address climate change, cyber threats, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, global pandemics, and other pressing issues. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the committee's founding. Reflecting on the last half-century, we are proud to have played a constructive role at each major juncture in the relationship, from hosting the Chinese ping pong team in 1972 to welcoming to the United States every Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. The National Committee has worked at the leading edge of Sino-American relations. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the National Committee and the 10th anniversary of China Town Hall, we can think of no better person to discuss Sino-American relations than Henry Kissinger, the father of the modern U.S.-China relationship. Dr. Kissinger served as National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations. He has been awarded honors too numerous to list, including, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize, and is the author of over a dozen books on politics and international relations, including one of the finest books ever written on China, called On China. He is currently the chairman of Kissinger Associates, and we are proud to say a vice chair of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He has been advising American presidents and Chinese leaders since he made his historic secret diplomatic mission to China in 1971. It is an honor to have him here with us tonight. I'd like to thank our partners at all 85 venues and our small but dedicated National Committee staff, which has done an extraordinary job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our local speakers, a veritable who's who of China experts in America. They have traveled throughout the country without compensation because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies in the long-term interests of the United States. Finally, we also thank the Star Foundation for funding China Town Hall, as well as United Airlines for its support of the program. We are now accepting questions submitted via Twitter. Please tweet us your questions using the hashtag CTH16. Let me now begin with a few of my own questions for Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's an honor to have you here. Let's start with some history of U.S.-China relations. For the younger members of the audience who don't remember or didn't know about your historic visit to China in 1971 when you feigned illness in Pakistan and went off to China, tell us about the state of the U.S.-China relationship at that point. What was the inspiration of your visit, and what did you hope to achieve?
In 1971, China and the United States had not had diplomatic relations for 25 years. There was an embargo on the United States side for buying any Chinese goods, either for import or even buying it abroad. And we had been involved in the Korean War, of course, on opposite sides, and there was constant tension between us. There had been a place, Warsaw had been designated as the one place where we could meet with the Chinese. And there had been 162 meetings of Chinese and American ambassadors that ended in less than an hour. So there was, to all purposes, no contact. In fact, it took us 3 years to figure out approaches to China that both sides could trust and that were technically feasible. So the reason I had to feign illness in Pakistan was because if we had announced that I was going to China, that would have been a diplomatic revolution. So the reason there was this opening to China is because China is a great country. And to keep China excluded from the international system means that you cannot really do all the things you ought to do to have a peaceful world or to get participation of one of the important nations. So President Nixon sent me to China for the purpose of opening relations. I didn't know what I was going to find. The Chinese didn't know what I was going to say. And I had 48 hours a 48 hours window in which we could explain my absence. So it was under great time pressure, and Zhou Enlai and I conducted all of the negotiations. So it was an exciting period, and it ended with an invitation from the Chinese government for President Nixon to visit China.
How important did the Soviet Union factor in your decision?
The Soviet Union was an important factor in two ways. One, it had acted as an adversary all around the world, and we wanted to show that we had other options and that we were trying to broaden the base for international conduct. And it was very important for China because the Soviet Union had moved over 40 divisions to the Chinese border, and the Chinese in 1969 had reason to fear or expect that a Chinese full-scale attack might follow, and border incidents had already started. So both of us had a Soviet reason for opening discussions.
Soon after your visit, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, after your visit then with President Nixon in Shanghai, where you had the Shanghai Communique on February 28, 1972, the National Committee hosted the Chinese ping pong team. What role did that play? Why was that so important?
Well, the audience has to understand there had been no contact. There had been no visitors from China and no visitors from America to China. And in April of 1973, the Chinese suddenly invited the ping pong team, the American ping pong team that was in Japan for a tournament to China. It was unexpected for us. It was unexpected for the ping pong team. And it was one of the breakthroughs of that period. So,
but what about the Chinese team coming here?
So then,
because you had already we'd established liaison offices at that point.
We had just established liaison offices, but the importance of the Chinese team coming here was that it was the first visit of a Chinese delegation that came to the United States. And I welcomed them at the White House. President Nixon welcomed them. And it was exciting for both sides. Of course, the Chinese ping pong players had never been in the United States. So it was a symbol of what the National Committee does in establishing people-to-people contact between the two sides.
What are the lessons, not necessarily from hosting the ping pong team, but that's part of it. What are the lessons from that period, for U.S.-China policy today?
The most important lesson that we have to learn, not just from that period, but in general, the Chinese have a different history and a different culture from the United States. We have lived securely. The Chinese have always had enemies all around them, and one can mention many differences. So it is important for the people of both sides to get to know each other, and it is extremely important for the political leaders of both sides to understand the way of thinking of the other. And one of the best things that Nixon did, and that I'd like to say contributed to at the beginning, was that in our first meetings, we didn't speak so much of our differences. We spoke of our objectives, and to see whether the objectives could be harmonized. And as these leadership meetings began percolating down to people, and as people could have experience in each other's country of not only the economists, but also of the way of thinking, I think that is an important, crucial element. There are millions by now, I think, of Chinese who have studied in the United States.
Yeah.
When we came to China, there were no Chinese that had ever studied in the United States, or probably in any Western country.
Yes, very few. Let's jump ahead to this morning's news. So from 1972, let's go to this morning's news, which talked about, I should say this is CCTV news, which talked about the visit of the president of the Philippines to China. He's accompanied by a delegation of 500 business people, and I expect he will leave China with billions of dollars of economic aid, and the business people will leave with a lot of deals. How does this fit in with kind of the Obama administration's pivot/rebalance? Because the Philippines were, one of our treaty allies, and how does this kind of fit into what is going on? And in fact, Gray from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, asks, is this a sign that the pivot has not been successful?
Well, I was not a great advocate ever of the word pivot, because basically the pivot was that we withdrew forces from Afghanistan and didn't change much in Asia, But as a result, the percentage of our forces in Asia was larger than it had been before. So the policy of the Philippines, or of any country, my view is each country has to know what its national interest is without lectures by the United States. The Philippines have an alliance with the United States, not as a favor to the United States, because they think that for their own security reasons, they are safer by having a relationship with the United States. If they get a different view, that's their privilege. That is something that countries do. I don't consider a visit by the Philippine president to China as abrogating the American alliance. And I'm in any case opposed to the notion that relations between China and the United States should be measured by the military dividing lines that exist between them. So if the Philippines want closer relations with China, this is not something to which the United States should object. If the relationships then go further and affect other aspects of the relationship, we'll have to deal with it when it arises.
But the Philippine president has announced that obviously the treaty alliance remains intact, but joint exercises with the U.S. military the one that is going on will be, he has announced, will be the final one.
Well, the question is who gains more from these exercises, they or we?
Yeah.
And so I don't think countries do us a favor by having an alliance with us.
Mm-hmm. You've met more Chinese leaders, I think, than any American has. Can you talk about how President Xi Jinping is similar to previous leaders, how he is different? And Zhi Jing from Cambridge adds, what do you think of President Xi's anti-corruption campaign?
Well, the Chinese have had 5 generations of leaders, in my experience, and in fact in the history of the People's Republic.
Right, and you've met with every generation.
And I've met with every generation. And each generation has sort of reflected the needs and the experiences. The Mao generation created the state. They had fought the wars. And they were at the very beginning of economic development. They were more concerned with ideology than with economics. The Deng generation began a process of reform. The Jiang Zemin generation brought China into a broad international economic system. The Hu Jintao generation sort of took a pause from big activities internationally. And Xi is trying to combine some of the ideology of the Mao period with the necessities that have evolved as a result of the technology and the global economics. So Xi is undergoing, it's leading a major reform of the Chinese system as it has evolved in the previous period. But of course he's doing it in a technology that is totally different. When I first came to China in 1971, we had practically no capacity to telephone the United States from China. There were no traffic gridlocks in Beijing because there was no traffic, there were no high-rise buildings, there was no internet, there was no... Almost everything that most of your listeners would take for granted didn't exist. As late as 1976, the trade of the United States with Honduras in Central America was greater than the trade with China. So the objective conditions now are hugely different. And the Chinese leader now has to deal with a technology and the means of communication and of an interaction with America that did not exist at the beginning.
Does he have traits? Does President Xi have traits that remind you of Mao? I mean, you used to talk philosophy with Mao. You had very broad-ranging conversations with Mao and Zhou.
Well, they were very conceptually oriented, and it is right. I had what would be considered philosophical conversations with both of them. But every Chinese leader that I have met is in a way more conceptual than American leaders. And the reason is this, one of the reasons is this. Americans think a stable world is normal. And so when the world isn't stable, there is a problem. When there's a problem, you solve the problem, and then you go on to something else. Chinese leaders think that a solution of a problem is an admissions ticket to another problem. So almost every Chinese leader that I've ever met has wanted to think in a conceptual way of policy as a process rather than as a program. So in that sense, they're all similar. Mao, of course, was much more ideological. And there are significant differences in that sense. But I've often been struck by the fact that if you look at a picture of a Chinese emperor receiving foreigners, it's very similar to a picture of a Chinese leader receiving a foreigner. There is the same half circle of chairs. There is a protocol that makes you feel you are moving into a very important encounter. And so I believe there's a certain continuity to Chinese culture that is important in understanding it.
Since 1949, we of course have not had a leader who has not lived through, a Chinese leader who has not lived through incredible instability.
Right.
That all 5 generations have seen chaos in China.
And that's also their big fear. I mean, all leaders in China have the fear of a breakdown of order and of chaos. And they identify that chaos also with what happened in the 19th century when China became subjugated by foreign countries.
And they've all either been part of or lived through the Cultural Revolution, you know, with the current leader, even before the Cultural Revolution, having been sent down to Shanxi to...
Well, almost every Chinese that I've known has been affected by the Cultural Revolution. And he says that it strengthened him.
Yeah.
But it still was a unique experience to be taken out of your familiar context, sent to the countryside and having to work in the agricultural fields.
Yeah.
Zhu Rongji, who was prime minister to Jiang Zemin, was there for 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting to speculate about it. At some point, assuming China remains stable, there will be a leader who has not experienced this instability, and will his or her reactions be very different from the previous? Obviously, it's going to be 7th or 8th generation before that happens.
Well, one of the aspects of China is that, as you say, not just the instability, the generation after the economic evolution, after China began to become a major industrial country, have a different life experience. The family does not have the same significance when people move into the cities from having lived in the countryside. So those are important changes that are going on.
As you would expect, we have a lot of questions about our election and U.S.-China relations. This one is from Frank from Chicago, which says both Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump have opposed ratification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. How would the ratification or non-ratification affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, China is not
a party.
Yet a party of the Trans-Pacific relationship, but it should be. So one should think of it in 2 stages. The Trans-Pacific relationship is important because the United States ought to create organic, non-military relationships with Asia, and it should be part of the structure of the Pacific through a partnership with Asia. So this should be created in order to prevent a split between Asia and the United States that would lead to great difficulties. Secondly, once the partnership is ratified, it should be open to China. And I think China should be an important element in it. And I say this because I'm convinced we are in a period where China is rising, the United States is evolving a new kind of policy. And if the thing we are aware of is constant adversarial relationships, then it will lead to a crisis sooner or later. So I favor any reasonable relationship that strengthens the ties across the Pacific and to create, if possible, an organic relationship between the United States and China.
Harry from Denver, Colorado asks, if you were to sit down with the next president, what advice would you give him or her on the U.S.-China relationship? What would you tell them to do first?
I think the first thing I would tell them to do is to put a man on their personal staff, a man or a woman, on their personal staff who knows something about China's history and culture and who can act as a liaison to the Chinese government. And he should be watching the many things that go on in the interaction to make sure that they follow a coherent theme. Secondly, I would use him.
But isn't that part of your old job as National Security Advisor? Or
well, when I was National Security Advisor, the job of the National Security Advisor was powerful, but I had 60 people on my staff. the National Security Advisor now has 700 people on the staff, so it's almost a different job. It's a major administrative job. So yes, it's the role of the National Security Advisor, but he cannot do all of this. And the second thing the president ought to do is, rather than adjudicate every dispute that goes on in trade or the South China Sea or wherever, he ought to try to sit down with a group of the key people he trusts to ask the questions: where are we trying to go? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to prevent? And then try to get a dialogue with the Chinese leaders on the same set of questions. Because otherwise there's always the danger that when you are so interconnected as we now are with communications and trade, that a lot of disputes come to the surface that are perfectly valid disputes, but they prevent you from getting a sense of perspective.
Do you think the Obama-Xi Sunnylands meeting is a good kind of model for what should go on early in the next administration with the new president and President Xi?
It was a good model, and in order to judge it, you really ought to judge or ought to know what they actually said to each other. And there's always the danger or the temptation when you have a summit meeting that the public relations people script what is going on. But as a model, yes, I think it's a good thing to do.
That struck me as somewhat similar to you taking a stroll with Joanne Lai and having these very...
Except I had no cameras there.
You had no camera, no script, but when you wrote about them, the discussions really, that's why earlier on I described them as philosophical. It really was discussion of history, discussion of worldview, discussion of...
It was amazing to me when I first came to China. I really knew very little about China because I couldn't ask the bureaucracy, since we didn't tell them I was going. And I was struck when Joan Lai met with us. He usually liked to start in the afternoon, but then he would meet for 5-6 hours, and he didn't seem to be bothered by any other business. And so we had long periods of discussion, and we both had come to the conclusion that we should be honest with each other about our directions, our purposes. Well, anyway, that's how these talks developed. It's harder to do now with modern machinery, but it still should be attempted.
Isabella from Orlinda, Tennessee asks, what are the greatest challenges the U.S.-China relationship will face in the near future?
Well, all these questions are good. There are a number of ongoing problems, like the South China Sea problem, which we, of course, which needs attention. Another important problem is whether we can develop a common policy towards North Korea. Because here is a state that is developing nuclear weapons, developing missiles, which constitutes a threat to all the surrounding area in Asia, and in the long term also to the United States. And it is a neighbor of China, and there's a long history of threats to the security of China evolving through Korea. So is it possible for us to develop a common policy towards towards Korea. Third issue will be the evolution of China into the status of a superpower and how one interacts, because we have never had to deal with another superpower. China has never had to deal. Well, we've had to deal with Russia. But our interaction with Russia was almost entirely geostrategic. There was next to no economic relationship between China and the United States, between Russia and the United States. Between China and the United States, there are daily hundreds of contacts. So to bring these into some systematic framework, I would think is a big challenge and opportunity.
Which fits into the next question, which is from Marco in Worcester, Mass. Do you worry about the cordial relationship between Russia and China? Should that be a concern that they're moving back together?
Well, you know, there are two levels to answer this. One, even if you're concerned, it's a mistake to admit it. And I think, I really believe we in America have to develop a view of what our national interest is and not fluctuate it with every election. The Chinese usually have a view of their long-term relationship. China and the United States have a long border. China and Russia have a long border and a long history of interaction. So it's natural that they should cooperate. Of course, we would not like to have both of them as enemies of the United States. And we would, in the normal course of events, prefer to have friendly relations with both of them. And I would think that any thoughtful American president would make that as his objective. But am I concerned? Well, I'm concerned when the United States looks as it has no relevance to a lot of problems that exist around the world. But I think that's an issue for America, and we have to help ourselves with respect to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned North Korea, but now China's relationship, because of the agreement to deploy THAAD, the relationship between China and South Korea has become more tense, and it remains fairly tense with Japan. What's the way forward on kind of China-South Korea relations, China-Japan relations? And that's asked by Vincenzo from Accord, New York.
A lot of this depends on what happens in North Korea. If North Korea builds up nuclear forces and acts as a threat to the security of the region, then this almost automatically produces a South Korean reaction.
Right.
Now, and of course, given the geographic proximity of North Korea and China, any weapon we put into South Korea to help our South Korean allies can have implications for China because it has capabilities. You can't, I mean, the territory is so relatively small. So I would think that if the North Korean problem could be solved, that is to say, if nuclear weapons and missiles could be removed from North Korea, some of the countermeasures with respect to them in South Korea would have a different character. And so I would imagine that if the North Korean issue were ever solved in a coherent way, that the deployment of high technology weapons in all of Korea could become a subject of negotiations. But in the present situation, it's possible that weapons in North Korea threaten Japan and us, and weapons in South Korea threaten China, and that's what makes it a tense situation.
Yeah. Are you optimistic? Very simple. Are you optimistic that we'll see some movement, some progress on that issue? That's a very optimistic scenario you painted, but you think there's any likelihood?
I think it is so obviously in the interest of the two sides that some solution, maybe not as comprehensive a solution as I mentioned, it's likely, yes.
This is from U Donghui in Falls Church, Virginia, about Taiwan. Since the 70s, when we established diplomatic relations with China, Taiwan has changed dramatically, and China is obviously more powerful. Is there a path forward for cross-strait relations, and what should the United States do?
Well, of course, not every problem in the world can be solved by the United States alone. What was achieved in that first meeting between Mao and Nixon, or in that visit, was the following. Before that, there had been the 162 meetings that I mentioned.
Right.
And they were very ritualistic. The Chinese would say that Taiwan should be turned over to them, and the Americans would say they want an assurance of peaceful process. What happened in the meetings when Nixon was in China was that we accepted the principle that there was only one China, that we were not supporting a two-China solution. The Chinese accepted the principle that this would take time to evolve. And since then, it has evolved. And so the question is whether the interaction that is developing between the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits will grow stronger and stronger. That's an unsettled issue that the future will have to decide.
From Santa Fe, what do you think are some of the missteps that have occurred in the U.S.-China relationship? Obviously, none could have occurred when you were Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, but since then.
On the Chinese, partly because their experiences in the 19th century and in general are extremely sensitive about American intervention in their domestic affairs. And on the other hand, it is impossible for an American president not to include some idea of general human rights in the American program. So how to meet the needs of both countries is important. We have not always handle that well. In the early stage of the Clinton administration, we made some public demands on China for alteration in their practices. But after 2 years, President Clinton changed that approach, and after that, relations on that issue became very good. I think in general, in the handling of South China Sea issues, for example, it is, of course, both sides are making military moves. But when we put television cameras on our warships, when they cruise around, we are presenting a challenge that I think we should avoid. The Chinese, on the same time, have to consider things, our sensitivities. But actually, if you look at the relationship between China and the United States since 1971, you can say that it's the most consistent American policy. Yeah. Every American administration, Democratic or Republican, has supported the statement that you made at the beginning, that the relationship between our two countries is the key element for peace and progress in the world. Mm-hmm. And there really hasn't been a big difference between Democratic and Republican administrations in the pursuit of that objective. During election periods, a lot of statements have been made, but I think I'm optimistic that after the election, the major outlines of the policy, the major goals, will be pursued.
Yeah. There really has not been a Republican-Democratic divide. It's much more been a party in power and a party out of power divide.
Exactly.
The party out of power is criticizing the party in power.
That's exactly right.
And that's been part of it. I'm surprised you didn't mention the Lee Teng-hui visit to the United States. Do you think that was a foreign policy mistake when the president of Taiwan came to Cornell to participate in, and he was an alumnus,
to
participate, and that then generated
yes,
enormous tension.
I had forgotten about that.
In the relationship.
That certainly caused some serious difficulties.
Yeah, caused some.
And it wasn't repeated.
I'm sorry?
It has not happened again.
Yes, it has not. Yes, so one could argue that we learned from that decision. This comes from Twitter. Holden Fitzgerald. What are the implications of the emerging protectionist attitudes within America, and how does that affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, if America becomes really protectionist, which I don't think will happen, but assuming it does, and if then other countries follow the same, and if the whole world gets encapsulated again in a trade war pattern, then the benefits of global trade will disappear. Probably the standard of living everywhere will be affected, and the consciousness that we are adversaries will rise, and that would be a very unfortunate outcome.
From Scottsdale, Arizona, Julian Howay asks, do you agree with the prediction that, say, by 2050, China will be the next superpower because it will have by far the largest economy in the world? And what would that look like from the U.S. perspective?
Well, that's the objective. that President Xi has said. He has said the goals of China should be that the two 100s, 100 years after the founding of the Communist Party, that's in 2021, right, where they're supposed to reach the level of the poorer countries of Europe. 2049, 100 years after the founding of the People's Republic. If you have two elaborated major states with all the complicated technology of the present period, whose interaction has not been tested by experience, you have a huge challenge to statesmanship. And President Xi has said that one should look for partnership rather than adversarial, and for a win-win relationship. I agree with that. How to do it, it's a huge challenge if this happens without having worked on a world order, which is more trustful, more stable, and more balanced than the present one.
When you talk with Chinese leaders, what do you tell them on how actions that they can take to improve the U.S.-China relationship? What can they do to make the relationship more constructive and productive?
When I talk to Chinese leaders, I try to give them an honest account of what I think is important in improving the relationship. Some of it is actions by the United States, sometimes it's actions by them. They should not act from a posture of strength and superiority. We should not act from a posture of teaching them how to behave in the international world. And so I have had dialogue now with Chinese leaders for nearly 50 years. And I'm not saying it always succeeded, but I think it's always been respectful. And on the whole, this is also true of our national conduct. Our relations with China, if you consider all the interactions, are not so bad.
I agree. I mean, they're, as we always say, they're
they're
deep and complex. There's some areas where they're bad.
There have to be problems.
Yes, some.
That's inherent in the nature of the interaction. There will never be a day where we can say now it. But
it's important. It's important we convey those problems when we talk to the Chinese leadership. We convey those problems, and we convey not only what the U.S. government can do to solve them, but what the Chinese government. I think, when we hosted President Xi and you and at dinner in Seattle, and he then went on and spoke and came to Washington and met with President Obama, and the cyber issue was terribly corrosive on the relationship. Businesses felt they were being hacked, their IPR was being stolen, it was being used by Chinese companies. It doesn't get a lot of media attention, but that's improving.
No, they made considerable progress.
That has been, so that when these issues are conveyed to the Chinese leadership by people like you, I think, or the President of the United States, it has an effect. Yeah, it has effects. So, Norman Kaplan from Cleveland, Ohio. Donald Trump has said he would reconsider the United States security arrangements with Japan and South Korea, and even allow them to acquire their own nuclear weapons. How do you think that would affect the region, and how do you think China would respond?
Well, the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Japan and Korea, especially given the history of Chinese relationships with Japan, would have a dramatic effect. It would surely increase the level of tension. It would lead to some kind of military competition, and it would be an outcome that we should be very eager to avoid, and we certainly should not bring it about by withdrawing existing arrangements we have and telling these countries they have to depend on their own technology, especially since they have a technology from which they can move into nuclear weapons with relative ease. So I did not think this is a statement that if Mr. Trump were to be elected, he should honor. I think it's a statement he shouldn't have made because it's not helpful to the situation.
Do you think the Chinese understand, there have been a lot of, as in many campaigns, there are a lot of anti-China statements made in the course of campaigns. Does that have a corrosive effect on the U.S.-China relationship, or do the Chinese basically get it? It's a political campaign.
Well, they get it as a political campaign on one level. But on the other level, they would ask themselves, these statements get made because there must be an audience for them. And so if there is a very big audience for anti-Chinese statements, whatever the administration tells them, they may not be able to control it. So that irresponsible statements about China cannot always be ignored as being a campaign rhetoric. And we have to develop a national ability to bring our public statements in line with our national necessities.
Yeah. When I made that statement to a senior elected official in the United States, his response with a smile on his face was, well, you think the statements on taxation and Social Security and terrorism are more accurate? Point being, we're not engaging in great dialogue on any level. We apparently have a viewer in Sweden who asks, Zebulon Carlander, do you believe there is a policy area where we could tap untapped potential for U.S.-China cooperation?
You know, this is sort of unorthodox. There is a proposal, so-called Silk Road proposal, on developing an infrastructure set of projects in Central Asia. And this was turned down earlier in this administration. I actually think and hope that the new administration will take another look at it, because the development of infrastructure in these somewhat backward regions now, it's not a militarily significant issue. So I think this is an area where we can cooperate. Funnily enough, I think Afghanistan is an area where we can cooperate. And as China grows towards the objectives that were described, there are a number of peacekeeping operations. They're participating in the anti-pirate thing efforts off the coast of Africa.
I think those are all great suggestions. A final question from Bobby Dietrich from Oakland, California. He wants to know, what's your favorite Chinese food?
I like the sweet and sour dishes.
The sweet and sour dishes. That works. Of course, my answer is
But I like the Szechuan food too, the spicy food.
Well, it's a wonderful way to end what has been a fabulous hour. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for being our vice chair. Thank you so much for giving of your time tonight. Thank you so much for the contribution that you have made to peace and prosperity and the U.S.-China relationship. It has really been an honor and a pleasure to be with you tonight. And thank all of the venues for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
NBR, Dr. Ellings was assistant director and on the faculty of the Jackson School from 1986 to 1989. My research time shows through. In this capacity, he was a member of the school's executive committee and responsible for a wide range of administrative functions. He taught courses dealing with Asia, American foreign policy, and international relations, including foreign economic policy and international political economy, and was director of the George E. Taylor Foreign Affairs Institute. In 1984 and 85, Dr. Ellings served as legislative assistant in the United States Senate, Office of Senator Slade Gorton. He was the senator's senior advisor for and responsible for legislation on foreign and defense policy issues. Dr. Ellings publishes articles and chapters regularly, and he has a very, very long list of books that I'm not going to share right now. He is the co-founder and co-chairman of the editorial board of Asia Policy 2006 to present, and founding editor of the NBR Analysis publication series. He established the Strategic Asia Program and Access Asia, the national clearinghouse that tracks specialists and their research on Asia, and has served as consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Department of State, and other US government offices and agencies. He received the University of Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award and was a nominee for the same award at California Polytechnic State University San Luis Obispo, where he taught in 1980 and 81. He specializes in the political economy of international relations and national security, with emphasis on East Asia. Dr. Ellings earned his BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Washington. He studied in China as well, and some of that in the early 1980s when it was really, really interesting. And his professional activities continue to take him overseas regularly. And so we are really delighted that today, for this hour, he is here with us in Pullman, Washington, sharing his insights on Xi Jinping, China's president, reformer, emperor, or authoritarian nationalist, is the question he will address. Please join me in giving Dr. Ellings a warm Cougar welcome.
The nicest thing that's ever been said to me, you just said, Lydia, was that I was alive. You know, I'm a live speaker. That's great. I was kind of impressed at how live Super K, Henry Kissinger, is. He's 93, and I just pray I have as much hair as he does when I'm 93. That's an amazing amount of hair. Actually, it's something to comb in the morning. One other thing, Lydia, you mentioned, and this is something I'm always pointing out. You know, you go and you have to say when you were born or something. I always like to point out this is 19, not 18. You know, this is an important distinction. Okay, well, I'm gonna start by referring to something that Steve Orlins mentioned, which was a dinner in Seattle 13 months ago when Xi Jinping landed on his way for meetings in Washington, D.C. and New York. And the one meeting he had where he engaged the public, it was totally private. This is not a public meeting, but there were 800 people there, was in Seattle. And I attended that. It was fascinating on a whole bunch of levels because I had an opportunity to sit for an hour and a half, 15 feet from this interesting leader, Xi Jinping. He sat, I'd say, rather regally. It was carefully scripted. He didn't say a word until he spoke at the podium. He sat at a long table. Imagine the head table was probably 80 feet long. And so there were dignitaries at it, and he was dead center. Next to him was his primary host. By the way, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations was one of the two host organizations. The other was the U.S.-China Business Council. The chairman of the U.S. Business Council then, that year, was Mark Fields, CEO, chairman of the Ford Motor Company, who sat right next to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping never acknowledged him, never spoke to him, never looked at him. There were jillions of cameras. The security personnel and the media from China overwhelmed everything else. The tables were populated, besides with media and security people, with business people. I'd say 50% of the room was filled with Chinese. And so, in any case, it went on. Xi Jinping sat there, and speaker after speaker went to the podium. Xi Jinping was officially welcomed by Commerce Secretary Pritzker, who spoke on behalf of President Obama, and said so. He never acknowledged her, never turned around. He had his back to the podium, right? Facing the audience, facing the cameras, brilliant spotlights on him. Gary Locke, the recent ambassador to China, spoke, and he didn't acknowledge him. Governor Inslee spoke. The mayor of Seattle spoke. Not once did Xi Jinping turn around until Henry Kissinger strode to the podium. And here, of course, is at that time 92-year-old, at the behest of Nixon, opened up China. And Kissinger did acknowledge at one point, but it was really Nixon's idea that this breakthrough take place. In any case, Kissinger strode to the podium at 92 years of age. And because of his role in U.S.-China relations, from 69, when he took over as National Security Advisor, particularly from 1971 to the present, he has stayed in contact, as he said, with Chinese leaders until then. In any case, out of respect for that long friendship, that close relationship between Chinese leaders and Kissinger, and age, Xi Jinping turned halfway around and turned his neck the other halfway around and listened to Kissinger speak. And Kissinger introduced him. The dinner ended with Xi Jinping speaking himself, carefully scripted. Winston Lord, a former U.S. ambassador to China, characterized the speech as basically full of newspeak. If you're a fan of George Orwell in 1984, you know what that means. But terms that really don't mean quite what they mean, and there was no content, but it didn't matter. It was diplomatic, and at the end, you had 800 people giving him a standing ovation. Well, okay, that's kind of sets the kind of tone for this. So I'm going to try to do two things really quickly. Why in the world do we care that much about Xi Jinping? Why should we know about him? Why should we care? And then secondly, once we do know something, some reason for knowing about him, what is it in particular? What is he like? And what is it we can learn about perhaps the future of China and U.S.-China relations and maybe world relations more broadly from knowing about him? So that's what I'm going to do really quickly, and I'm hoping to do so. This is going to be rapid fire, and I apologize. There's going to be a lot of information in a short period of time. So going ahead of and anticipating a little more than what was said in Kissinger's remarks, today China, depending on how you measure its economy, is number one or number two in the world. If it's measured in nominal terms, according to current exchange rates, it's number two. But even in nominal terms, with current exchange rates, its industrial sector is 1.5 times the size of America's, which is a huge change in world affairs. Since the late 19th century, America's industrial sector has led the world. That is no longer the case. According to another type of measurement of economies, PPP, the size of China's economy is already bigger than that of the United States. So when he talks about 2050 or 20 whatever, essentially you should understand that really now China has a sense that its economy is an enormous factor and in many ways more capable than that of the United States. In some ways not as capable. It's not as innovative and so on, but in many measures as or more capable. Secondly, China's role in world trade is more than the United States. Of course, we've always, for so many years, been the world's largest trading nation. We're not anymore. China's turnover in trade in goods exceeded that of the United States starting in 2012. In addition, China, as you undoubtedly know, has embarked on an enormous military buildup and modernization program, taking what was a Soviet-style, bureaucratic, ineffective land army and transforming it into the world's second most powerful military. Whether it's land forces, air, naval forces, cyber, space, and so on. It's an extraordinary accomplishment that China continues to work on at a very rapid pace. And interestingly, in naval and projection forces. So what had been a traditional land power is now thinking in more blue water navy and global terms. In addition, China has embarked on a lot of initiatives, diplomatic and economic, that suggest high ambition. Kissinger referred briefly to an effort, an initiative involving Central Asia. He was probably talking about two. One is the One Belt, One Road initiative, in which China is looking at investing. This is not a bank operation, but actually investing in projects of infrastructure that go out through Central Asia and link China to Central Asia. Pipelines, roads, railroads, and so on. And also those kinds of links, railroads especially, that would extend down through the Malay Peninsula, down through Indochina, especially through Cambodia and Laos. So that's kind of the One Road. Interesting, the One Road really refers to maritime initiatives, and the One Belt more through Central Asia toward Europe. At the same time, it has the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which now has 57 countries signed up. I think this is kind of a very interesting initiative by China. It's sort of an alternative to the World Bank. The idea would be that this would focus on Asia and utilize the monies from all over the place, not just in China, to invest in areas that China cares about. So it's, and then of course, often I would expect and hope that to the benefit of neighbors of China. Interestingly, they've taken a very international approach, and if you look at the staff, the makeup, and everything of the AIIB, which is headquartered in Beijing, it has former World Bank people, former ADB people, a Chinese as president, but all kinds of other folks in it. It's fascinating and suggests to me another initiative which should tell us something about China's ambitions, global leadership ambitions. One of the points that China makes clear over and over again is not only is it interested in institutions that it calls 21st century institutions, as opposed to the World Bank and ADB and so on, which it characterizes as 20th century institutions. So of these 21st century institutions, one that it's really concerned about is those institutions that are monetary, like the IMF. It talks about less reliance and actually substituting for the US dollar as the global currency. So it's seeking in various ways to find alternatives in international exchange to the dollar. So to add to what you just heard from Henry Kissinger, we really have, in essence, the rise of a continental-sized power, unlike any rise of any continental-sized power since the United States itself. And of course, it has a population that's 4 times the size of the population of the United States. And so the potential there is obviously tremendous. Well, this is an extraordinary event in world affairs. And obviously, the leader of that country you'd want to know about. Particularly, and let me add one other element to this. There are probably lots of students of history here, and even if you're not, you've been reading probably in newspapers, the New Yorker, who knows where, efforts by journalists and academics to try to understand and put in perspective the rise of China in view of the history of the rise of great powers. It's not a pretty history. So if you go back to this and read the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is the first tremendous history written, you learn about the rise of Athens and the threat that that rise opposed to Sparta. If you think of the two, it's really interesting. You think of Athens. I mean, Athens invented invented philosophy. It invented modern mathematics. It invented extraordinary, innovative culture for its time. Sparta was known for generals and fighting. Athens too, but Athens, if you ever have the time, I would say read the short version, the Cliff Notes to Thucydides. It's a tough slog. I've read the whole thing, but in any case, what happens there is that Athens decides to extend its power to include a town called Megara, and that's one step too far for Sparta. Sparta wins that war. So the more, you'd say, primitive, less innovative society actually wins. Well, the reason I mention this is that the history of rising powers, the history of it almost always results in major war. You think of the 20th century, the industrialization and rise of Japan, the industrialization and rise of Germany. The industrialization and rise of America was noted for some nationalism, but we were taught a lesson early on by Britain not to mess around. If you recall, one of the first things we did was go to war with Britain after we were founded and had our capital burned to the ground. That was humbling. And we had our own horrible war in the Civil War. So while nationalism was high and we had a spat with Spain, Spain was not a major power at the time. It didn't result in world war. That's an exception. Another exception was the rise of Russia and the Soviet Union, which, with its industrialization, highly nationalistic and also driven by a global ideology, a global conquering ideology, nonetheless was parried by the United States and its allies in an extraordinarily successful strategy. In any case, there are exceptions to rises of great powers, exceptions to the incidence of major war. But in most cases, war results. It's just a sobering thought, and so placing into context what Kissinger and Steve Orlins were talking about, understand that the likelihood, the percentage likelihood, is that war would result as a consequence of the rise of China and the resulting competition between the extant power and the status quo power, the United States. All right, let me talk about Xi Jinping. So we need to know about Xi Jinping. What's he all about? Are these prior eras, like the extreme nationalism of Germany and Japan associated with their industrialization, are those actually maybe indications of what China is like today? And were the leaders of Germany and Japan like Xi Jinping? Well, Xi Jinping is fascinating on a whole host of measures. I suggested in my opening remarks, how successful he embodies the appearance and bearing of a traditional Chinese leader. He sat there, didn't say a word. He exuded confidence. He exuded strength in that room, and there was no question that he was special in that room of 800 people. There was nobody comparable. He didn't feel necessary to speak one syllable to anybody. He has an interesting bearing. He has an interesting background. He's what they call a Princeling. Princelings within China are considered anybody who's an offspring of anybody who's important. But in the China field, and among us China watchers, a Princeling has a very specific meaning because it relates to their ability, to some extent, to become a true leader in the country. So he's a Princeling in that his father was a senior leader, going back early on with Mao and so on. It wasn't, for any of that generation, a smooth experience with the Cultural Revolution and all that, but his father was a senior leader. And so she went to a very exclusive school, just for the children of senior leaders. The most exclusive school in the country. He got to know them. He got to learn, in a sense, became part of the new royalty of China. And I commend you to read, if you're really interested in this stuff, a new book by Chung Lee, who is at Brookings, and it's on Xi Jinping and the current political system. It's a new book. It's absolutely terrific. The only downside is it's about that thick. And you will read more Chinese names than you've ever seen in your life. So, in any case, Xi Jinping has a fascinating upbringing. Just to boil it down to a few things, he creates great relationships and loyal relationships throughout his life. He also begins to have policy preferences. And these policy preferences include at least some economic reform, but as best we can tell, economic reform within the country that benefits Chinese enterprises. He believes also in a strong socialist component of the economy, so strengthening, not weakening, state-owned enterprises. But favoring all these domestic enterprises over foreign companies. So in some contrast to what you heard, most international companies now are very concerned about their futures in China and have begun to diversify their investments down in China. There's a lot of concern about the direction, failure of economic reform. Secondly, in the political realm, Xi Jinping is absolutely against any political reform. Zero. No democratic Western-style political reform. Zero. In fact, if anything, strengthen the Communist Party, purge those or as many as you can who are corrupt. Of course, the whole system, by the way, is corrupt, so that's impossible. But you can get rid of the worst characters, strengthen this Communist Party, and strengthen its role in Chinese society and in its leadership role. Soon after being chosen as leader and obtaining that office, and by the way, since Deng Xiaoping, the leaders have gone in 2 5-year terms. They get 10 years, 2 5-year terms. According to that schedule, he's chosen, and then he takes office a few years ago. His first term is up next year. So in any case, the first thing he did was launch, and you heard again a reference to it, this anti-corruption campaign. Well, since just about every official in China is probably corrupt to some extent, he has free rein on choosing who the heck he's going after. 100,000 officials have been prosecuted and all found guilty. That's something in the system. If you are accused and you are brought before court, you are guilty. Whether you are or not, but you are guilty. So all of them are guilty. 160 of them were top-ranking officials, really top-ranking, including a couple members who had been members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. That's 7 people. There are 7 people who ultimately rule China, headed by the chairman of the party, Xi Jinping. There are 7 of them. 6 of the 7 right now are close allies of Xi Jinping. So in any case, 160 top officials are purged. 100,000 are prosecuted. It continues. Huge crackdown on dissidents, civil society members, lawyers, and there's been a complete clampdown politically. The internet has been much more sharply restricted, So you have, in fact, if you were saying, well, has there been any political reform, enormous step backwards in terms of political reform. He's been very clear on this. Now, I want you to think just for a second, if you are an autocrat, you're in an autocratic system, what are the bases of your legitimacy? Well, for the last few decades, the bases of legitimacy for Chinese leaders have included tremendous economic growth, 500 or more million people coming out of poverty. Imagine that. This is the greatest alleviation of poverty due to market reforms in the history of humankind. The fastest elevation out of poverty of any group of human beings in history, because they were given the opportunity to own things, invest in something, and make money on it. So that was a basis of legitimacy. And then, of course, because they're not elected, there's no basis there, there's, in addition, embodying the Chinese nation, national aspirations. And finally, in the Chinese context, the sheer ability to wield power is respected. So if you can suppress riots, if you can maintain order, that also is an indication to the people that you are a legitimate ruler. The economy has slowed down. It's slowed down from 10% and 11% growth rates to 6-point-something%, and it may be lower. You can't always trust anybody's statistics. It's hard to know, but clearly the economy is slowing down. It's not expected to recover to those amazing highs that existed for 30 years, 35 years. So decreasingly, economic growth and economic success is a pillar of legitimacy. So if you imagine again, okay, why am I a legitimate ruler? That narrows it a bit. You've got to reduce economic expectations, and you have to embody more and more the nation. Hence the China dream. Xi Jinping's basic slogan and claim to legitimacy is the China dream. The return of China to its greatness. Greatness in wealth, greatness in power, greatness in essence as the Central Kingdom. All these, think about again the One Belt, One Road, the AIIB, the greatness of China in terms of military power. And so Xi Jinping has become more clearly a nationalist leader of China than any prior leader in the modern era. Since 49. Every leader has been highly nationalistic, but there were other bases of power for Mao, ideology, the revolution, personal charisma. Xi Jinping, by the way, is trying to develop that personal charisma himself. And so that's another element which is fascinating to watch. So we have, as China rises and slows its economic growth, a powerful national leader, more powerful than any individual leader of China since at least Deng Xiaoping and maybe Mao. And that's what we've got. I would argue that if whoever comes in, and it's going to be undoubtedly, it looks like, if the polls are correct, it's going to be Hillary Clinton as president, that, as somebody indicated here, as Kissinger did, you're going to need some great advice on China, because China is the most powerful nation in the Eurasian continent, and in some ways developing power greater than that of the United States. If so, we better be pretty smart. And if history tells us anything, when great rising powers rise to this extent, war happens. And when they're autocratic, it happens even more often, because their basis of legitimacy is narrow, and they really have to embody nationalism first and foremost. Again, you know, historians and others are looking to the 30s, 1930s, and other eras for analogies. So we know this is a huge issue. We know we have to understand Xi Jinping, and we have to understand China. So let me just sum up here. I've given some thoughts, and I will sum up in three things. Number one is, back to the title of this talk, is Xi Jinping a reformer? No, he's not a reformer. Around the edges, maybe an economic reform, absolutely not a political reformer. Second, is he an emperor? Well, he can't pass down his own power to his daughter. He's not going to pass it down. I mean, there is a communist precedent for this, and it's in North Korea. The Kims, it's a dynasty. He's not going to create a dynasty. But he is, if we are reading indications correctly, he is thinking of perhaps not just creating and selecting the next leader. He may be positioning himself to retain power beyond the 10 years, which has been the tradition since Deng Xiaoping, perhaps, and maybe perhaps playing a role more like Deng, where he actually pulls the strings behind the scenes and so retains ultimate power. So one of the things we have to watch, this is again under this kind of emperor rubric, how serious a leader is he? Is he going to pull a Putin, in other words? Is he going to stay in charge even after the 10 years? That's a possibility. We have to watch it very, very carefully. Finally, is he an authoritarian nationalist? Yes. That's what he's all about. That's what he's all about. He is seeking to embody the Chinese nation and the Chinese people's ambitions. And I'd say he's done an amazing job in view of the fact that we never considered him before he had this job at all a charismatic leader. But he's played the role to the hilt. So there you go. And I'm happy to entertain questions. I hope you've got a lot of them. There couldn't be a more important topic than the rise of China and the character of its leadership. Yes? Yeah, I'd throw it at you, but you...
Well, so if he did stay past the 10 years, what would that mean? What would that look like?
Well, there are these 5-year terms, and so next year, Xi Jinping is scheduled next year to name his successor. And there's a Central Committee meeting this month, and there is a big party congress next year. Now remember, you have to think of the Chinese context. It's the Communist Party that's determining all these things. So that's who's doing it. There are fewer than 400 members of the Central Committee. The Politburo has 25, and the Standing Committee of the Politburo has 7. So he will name or not name that individual. And we're trying to understand, this is always trying to look inside the black box. When decisions like this are made in secrecy by essentially 7 people negotiating among themselves and their friends and their allies and their, different factions, it's an unknown. But it looks like there is some postponing going on. And so that might mean that Xi is contemplating either trying to solidify supporters so he can name somebody confidently later, or looking to retain power over the longer term. No. No, it's not. It's not possible, and there is no comparable situation developing like in North Korea. It's not happened. Okay. Next question.
What is Xi Jinping?
You ought to give your name and maybe your major or something about yourself.
I'm Mitchell. I'm a double major in communication and political science. I was wondering what Xi Jinping's, what the public in China's opinion is on him. Do they like him?
He's extremely popular. In fact, this is one of the things, you know, if you're in a communist country, and a guy on the streets asks, what do you think of the leader? You're probably going to say, oh, I think the leader's great. But in fact, as far as we can tell, as high as 80% approval rate. And I can tell you, I have friends, Chinese friends who have been living in this country, or they're in Singapore or so on. They're thrilled by him because of his strength and a lot of reasons. They're thrilled by his wife, who was this absolute singing star. She was this huge star. He's kind of a boring looking guy, but he married this, I mean, she's just incredible voice, was famous. She was way better known than he was. In any case, anyway.
Hello, my name is Henry Whedon. I'm a mechanical engineer, so a little off topic, but this isn't specifically about Xi Jinping, but a little bit more about the Chinese economy as a whole.
Sure.
From a Western perspective, China puts little emphasis on the violation of intellectual property protections, such as copyright infringement.
That's correct.
What are the pros and cons of this from an economic standpoint?
Sure. I completely disagree with Steve Orlins. It's a gigantic problem that's not gone away, and it's part of the Chinese strategy and part of their industrial policy and 5-year plans, year after year. Acquisition and then development of technologies, their number one priority in all kinds of major fields, from biochemistry, I mean, you name the field, smart cars and solar technology and wind tech, anything cutting edge that would be important to the development of a nation. It is their goal to acquire technology by however means they can get it. And about 3 years ago, we put together a national commission headed by then recent Ambassador to China, John Huntsman, on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, retired Admiral and former Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair. On that commission, we had the recent chairman and CEO of Intel. We had a former senator who had been on the 9/11 Commission. We had, anyway, a variety of terrific Americans to look at this issue of the theft of American intellectual property. They looked at the issue as a whole, tremendous amount of research, interviews, and so on. The conclusion was, and this is 3 years ago, that about 70 to 80%, in some cases as low as 50, but usually 70 to 80% of IP theft globally was done by China. And so you think about the Chinese economy as being somewhere between 14 and 18% of the world economy. But they were accounting for 50 to 80% and usually 80% of IP theft. The IP theft had been industrial policy in China from the very get-go. And so by 1979, it was very focused initially on nuclear questions, missiles, a lot of national security kinds of technologies. By 1979, we were able to document, and Congress had done a lot of investigating on this earlier, that the Chinese had already gotten from our national labs. We invited Chinese specialists into our national labs who were enthusiastic to be engaging China. National labs, all kinds of means. They already had acquired miniaturization technologies for nuclear weapons, as well as the technology to build a neutron bomb, which we never did, by 1979. So it's part of industrial policy in China to acquire, as I said, the highest technology. Here's a great example of what goes on. Not only is it cyber attacks, it's all by all industrial means. So industrial espionage means employees, graduate students in universities, and it's all kinds of folks in all kinds of ways. A friend of mine, a executive out of Washington, D.C. in one of the trade associations there, was in Beijing a couple of years ago, and the Chinese in this one office were proud to show her on this giant board all American National Science Foundation grants. Imagine a giant wall filled with every National Science Foundation grant for every imaginable biotech, physics, you name it. And they were proud to be tracking what professor got that and how they were tracking it. Well, tracking, what did that mean exactly? So it's an all-out effort by all means to acquire technology, and we have to understand that. That has to be our policy. We just have to get it. You ask any American company that, even if they just make tractors, what their knowledge is of, at this point, of how their stuff has been ripped off, it's remarkable. Most companies, though, will not go public for two reasons. One, their stock price will take a hit because they've admitted their stuff's been stolen and that they can't do anything about it. They also don't want to say anything because they're trying to do business in China, and they'll make even more of an enemy out of the Chinese state if they do. So they're intimidated from saying things. So one of the real issues we had on this commission was interviewing American companies and getting the truth out of them. And they would tell us the truth so long as we promised we wouldn't tell anybody. So we have all these anecdotes, unbelievable numbers of anecdotes. And by the way, this was a frustration to the current president, and I assume presidents before, because a company would be complaining bitterly to the president that, hey, if you're going to talk to Xi Jinping or whatever leader before, you've got to raise this incredible issue with they stole our stuff and this all happened. And then the president says, okay, and then the company gets cold feet. Well, we might be able to work this out with China. We've still, we've got $1 billion in sales there, and we don't want to jeopardize that. So I'm not privy to tell you, I can't tell you an enormous number of anecdotes, but a bunch of them are in the press. And so occasionally a company has had it, or it's a smaller company whose business has been destroyed. They've got nothing to lose, and so they'll tell the truth. But it affects universities. Frankly, every university in the country that's doing any cutting-edge research in engineering, physics, and you name it, is vulnerable. And we just have to realize it. Here, there, it's not just in China. Companies today, Steve Orlins doesn't want to say it, but if you represent a major foreign company and you go into China, you don't take your computer, you take a blank computer. Nothing on it. And you leave it before you come home. So I'm just telling you the unvarnished truth here. It's tough. It's really, really tough. Now, in part, this is government directed. In part, it's allowed. Just go. It's a free-for-all. So this isn't this isn't just purely bureaucrats in Beijing saying, do this, do that. It's also saying to their entrepreneurs and so on, go for it. So it's both the kinds of, you've heard about the PLA unit that hacked this and hacked that. Sure, there's that. And that unit now is dispersed. It's no longer in that building in Shanghai, but there are others elsewhere. So it's an enormous problem. It is an absolutely enormous problem. And the main effect, of course, on companies and on foreign countries is that it reduces incentive to innovate. If your stuff's going to get stolen, why do I continue to innovate? Why do I continue to invest? Because I'll spend all the money on investing, and the stuff is just stolen. So it's a big issue that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching. I actually served as director of the staff of that project and had to live and breathe it. It was more of an eye-opener. I knew it was going to be bad. I did not know how bad. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Eric Gada. I'm a senior and I'm majoring in finance. I actually studied abroad in Chengdu, China.
Oh, you
this
did?
last semester, yeah.
Chengdu.
It was great. Really good food. He's right. Kissinger was right about that.
Now, Chengdu is, aerospace. It's down there in southwestern China. And on the other hand, what did you learn that China's #1, and that what did you learn about America when you were there?
What I learned about America?
Yeah, what did they say about America?
Well, one of the my question, kind of one thing we talked about a lot with it, we were there, is individualism versus collectivism.
Oh,
And I was just curious on your insight there. Do you think we kind of experienced and saw that China was becoming a lot more individualistic? Do you think that will affect their economy, and do you think the government is going to try and stop that movement, or do you think they'll try and keep it collective?
Okay, well, that's the kind of $64,000 question about China, right? $64 billion, trillion question. China is capable of democratizing, as proven by Taiwan. Taiwan has an incredibly vibrant democracy. Amazing. But I will have to say that the Communist Party has a pretty firm grip. While education levels and so on have gone up so much, and the bases for example, especially for demanding rule of law. I should point, this is really important to point out. The #1 issue for most Chinese, and why there's a flood, one of the reasons there's a flood of money to the United States and other parts of the West from China, is rule of law. Rule of law is huge, and there's no way under the Communist Party there will ever be rule of law, because that means they can't pull the trigger. You can't have an independent judiciary and a single party dictatorship, right? So rule of law is gigantic. And all those Chinese have worked so hard, those 500, 600 million who've come out of poverty. They own something. And they know that even though they own it, in a court of law, if a party person comes in and rips it off, or whatever takes place, the big shots come in, pay you 5 cents on the dollar, and next thing you know, you're on the street. They don't have rule of law. They have rule by law, but they don't have real rule of law. And that is spreading throughout the country. The Chinese understand it. And that is, to me, gives me the greatest hope for change. But that butts in right against the Communist Party. And so on the one hand, you've got this huge demand for rule of law, but on the other hand, they just think Xi Jinping's the greatest thing. So it's complicated. And but I got to tell you, rule of law is really the issue. Really, really the issue. Now, with regard to collectivism or individualism and so on, we can argue endlessly about, who gets along better. Do Chinese get along better with Chinese than Americans get along with better? I don't want to even begin to judge that. But I can tell you that rule of law is palpable. And for any of you who know, and your parents, think about your grandparents coming out of the Depression, working hard, you own your own home, you can defend it in a court, in an impartial court. And in China, you can never depend on that the court will be impartial. Yes?
Hi, I'm Chase. My major is still undecided, but I'm thinking of either Asian studies or foreign language. My question is, to a fault, I would say that the cornerstone of American politics is charisma. However, you stated that you don't think that nobody really saw I can't say the name, sorry, but
Yeah, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, as a charismatic leader before he rose to power, what would you say were the defining traits that allowed him to raise to power despite this? And would you say that those traits contribute to the rising power of China?
That's interesting. Kissinger wrote, by the way, I got to refer to Kissinger wrote a great little book, which I read as an undergraduate, in which he looked at the bases for legitimacy of leadership. And charisma was one of them, charismatic leadership. Xi Jinping, in part, showed early on he had the bearing of it, and he's a big guy. The biggest Chinese leader since Mao or something. You know, he's a big guy. And he had the bearing early on. He made the relationships. He didn't have charisma in terms of the TV personalities we think about. I would have to say, though, between the Donald and Hillary, we're not talking great charisma here. I don't, I don't see a lot of charisma there, but maybe I'm misreading it. But charisma is important, and she has the right kind for China, is my judgment. I've been watching, I've been looking over the border and/or going into the country since 1969. And I think he really has his finger on embodying that traditional notion of a strong leader. And Hu Jintao did not have it. Jiang Zemin, not really. Deng, in a funny way, I mean, he's a little tiny guy, but Deng Xiaoping did. He mainly blew smoke in people's faces. I mean, he was a tough little guy. But anyway, yeah, charisma is a very interesting question, but I would say it's one of Xi's strong points in the Chinese context. Questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Richard, my name is Xiaochi Ma, and I study in crop science, it's agriculture. So if I remember...
You're the second Ma I have met today.
Really? Wow.
So I have to ask, so do you have a Muslim background with the name Ma?
No.
Okay.
Oh yeah, some people have,
Right.
but I don't.
Okay.
Don't have.
Well, you're the second one who has not. I keep asking the question. I'll get somebody one of these days. Okay.
Okay, so...
Which part of China are you from?
South Central China,
Where?
Hunan province.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I studied in Anhui Dashui at one point.
Okay.
It's kind of the center of the country, one of the poorest parts of the country. Oh, anyway, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So if I remember correctly, you defined Xi as an authoritarian nationalist.
Yeah.
So could you give me more detail on that? How do you define this word authoritarian?
Sure.
And,
he's not elected. He's he's an autocrat.
Okay, and is it positive or negative?
And it's just a factual statement. He was not elected.
Okay.
He's purged a lot of people who might pose a problem. I'm just being factual about it. 100,000 purged, 160 top leaders, including the 2 top PLA officers under Hu Jintao. So he's been very effective at consolidating power. So no question, he's authoritarian. These people didn't end up, they ended up in jail. They didn't end up just losing their jobs.
So you mean he just has the power by himself?
He has consolidated a lot of power with the support. As you know, he has 5 additional members, friends of his, close associates, on the Standing Committee of the Politburo.
Okay.
I would suggest, for a great examination of what's going on, and Chinese politics is like any authoritarian one-party system, largely a black box. And how do you see inside it? Because it's not like they go on the street and have debates and everybody gets to watch and television's in there and they decide, yeah, let's purge this guy, let's send him out to here, and they don't do that. It's all secret. So the best look inside the black box I have seen lately is Chung Lee's new book on Chinese politics and Xi Jinping. I recommend it to you. Often, when you look at communist countries, communist-led countries, you try to understand factions. Are they personal? Are they around policy? How many factions are there? Who are the factions? What loyalties are going on? All these machinations. We can determine that among the Princeling elitist group that Xi Jinping heads, along with Jiang Zemin is his mentor. So it's kind of according to Chung Lee, he calls it the Jiang-Xi faction versus Wen Jiabao Li Keqiang faction. All right? Yeah. So, all right, so you got these two factions. One's more populist, one's, you know, that kind of Li Keqiang faction is a little more populist. But in the end, there are these two factions. According to Chung, I watch these things, read all the studies. He's probably pretty right. And so she has been very effective at, while there's a balance between the two factions, he's really dominant. His faction is more dominant. And in order to maintain that dominance, we're all anticipating as we watch the development of the black box, we're seeing how much time she needs to ensure that his faction retains control. And does he, in fact, need to retain his control personally? Because he is more charismatic. He is effective. And he may be personally extremely ambitious. We know he's ambitious, but we just don't know. So I recommend that book. Anyway. Yes, sir.
Charles Carver, material engineering. But with the death of Lee Kuan Yew, do you think Singapore would still be able to maintain its unique mediator relationship between the United States and China, or People's Republic of China?
Singapore, oh God, Singapore is fascinating. How many been to Singapore? Anyway, I guess one person's been to Singapore. Yes, so Singapore is this brilliantly led city-state which has combined conservative, quasi-authoritarian political system with extreme economic, a very extremely open free market, which is quite a model that China has looked at. China looked at Japan, China looked at South Korea, China looked at Taiwan and Singapore, Deng Xiaoping and the gang, because these places were going wild economically, and they were looking for models. And Singapore was a big one. And Lee Kuan Yew personally said, look at how well we've done, you should be like us. And so Singapore is a fascinating place. It has played the balance of power game also brilliantly. It's far enough away from China. It has encouraged visits and even a U.S., kind of a part-time U.S. Navy base. It has great relations in China. It's kind of playing all sides as you'd have to in a city-state. It has a very strong military for its little tiny size. Kind of like Switzerland. Switzerland, people always said, oh, that's a neutral country. Yeah, it's a neutral country that's armed to the teeth. Every Swiss citizen has a rifle. And every man, anyway. Any man had a rifle, and I forget how many bullets. So Singapore has kind of taken the same approach. And we will see, depending on how the ebb and flow between the U.S. and China, the extent to which it continues to seek just a balance between the two. It seeks a balance. Like Vietnam seeks a balance. Like up until recently, the Philippines sought a balance. That's another story. Like Korea seeks a balance. Like Japan seeks a balance. Everybody wants a balance there. Most of them. And Singapore, the ultimate example. Yeah. Any more? Okay, I apparently have to, I get to go to the airport too. One more, quick one? Quick one, anybody else? Somebody new?
Quick question.
Okay.
So you talk about the rise of the power will result the wars, and you talk about there is an exception. Do you think there is an exception for China?
We have to. It's a nuclear world. There's no option. But that means we have to be really smart.
So,
America can't do as we've been accused of, Churchill accused of, we can't do everything wrong first and then finally get it right. It's really difficult. But so much of it is going to rely on Chinese patience and not, well, I just pray that China stays stable so Chinese leaders can keep their heads cool. That's what worries me. An unstable China is a far more dangerous China in terms of its foreign policy.
Thank you.
Okay, there you go. Sure.